Welcome to this podcast with me, Matt Batchelor, DPA at Burgess. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ewan Ferguson, an experienced member of our safety and security team in London. Hi, Ewan. What will we be talking about today?
Hi Matt, and thanks very much for the introduction. We're going to talk about cyber. It's a big talking point, and when we talk about cyber on board yachts, it can sometimes sound complicated, perhaps even overwhelming for some. But the reality is a lot of cyber incidents start with very simple things, an email or a login or a moment of trust. So today we are deliberately keeping cyber simple, or at least we're going to try. We'll talk about why protecting accounts matters, the importance of strong passwords and MFA, and we're going to look at why the National Cybersecurity Centre is now encouraging the use of passkeys. It's not about technology specifically, it's more about good safety practices.
Okay then, so for this discussion, we want to keep it grounded and practical. From your perspective, why is that important?
So, cyber incidents can often start with some basic failures, not necessarily advanced attacks that we hear are possible. We're human after all. It's easy for us to put off doing some simple measures to protect ourselves. Another reason is that overcomplexity sometimes can lead to disengagement. So simpler explanations can lead to better engagement and compliance. We don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel. Cyber should really fit into the existing framework of the safety management system.
So we should mitigate cyber risks in the same manner as any other onboard risks?
Yeah, exactly that, yeah.
Okay. At a basic level, what do you consider the core cyber risks on board a yacht?
So this is based on the cyber incidents that are reported to us. The risk revolves around account access, trust. So it might be that a trusted supplier's email account has been compromised. Have a think about what they're asking. So an email address that you know and you've trusted previously, have a think about what they are asking, especially things like change of bank details. Don't be afraid to break that loop. Stop and think. Most incidents begin with email access, login credentials. It's a moment of urgency or assumption. There's a pressure to perhaps to pay invoices, threats of detention, loss of service. We have seen, haven't we? We've seen where the emails that are supposedly from poor state control, which, they weren't. These are big indicators. When you get that pressure and sense of urgency, they're big indicators when the bad actors are putting that time pressure on. So again, just stop and think. Don't rush into anything.
Is there a commonality between cybersecurity and physical security insofar as who has access and how that access is controlled?
Yes, there are definitely some similarities. Digital access should be treated with the same sort of discipline as physical access. So when it comes to accounts or systems, you want to know who has access. Why do they need access? How do they gain access? And when do they gain access? We've heard before reports of technicians. This isn't malicious activity, but technicians who have genuine reason to access the onboard systems. And you don't really want that happening necessarily where it involves, a system update and reboot when you're in arrival or departure conditions, do you?
So, Ewan, from reported cyber incidences from yachts, should we be concerned about targeting of email and online accounts?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the more common types of cyber incident reported. Email accounts, they function as a key. Sometimes we hear the term a digital master key, because once your email account has been compromised, if you have a think about it, attackers can then reset passwords elsewhere. We've probably all been in that situation where we've tried to log into an application. We can't remember our login details, so we click on the link, forgotten password, and that sends a link to our email account. So yeah, they have that ability quite easily to reset passwords elsewhere. They are then able to issue believable instructions, and they also tend to hide their activity over time. They get to know your email activity and your contacts. So look out for changes to the rules within your email account, changes to the folder structure that you don't recognize. Take a moment, stop and think. If you see changes to patterns or patterns that you don't recognize, take a moment to stop and think. The loss of account control is not just an IT issue, it's possibly an operational and quite easily a financial risk.
For many years, Burgess has been encouraging the use of strong passwords and multi-factor authentication. In simple terms, how does multi-factor authentication protect users? And is that still sound advice?
Yeah, it's still the advice we go by. Strong passwords and multi-factor authentication remain important controls. They definitely help to reduce the number of attacks. It's maybe worth explaining multi-factor authentication, or MFA. That is basically, it's a way of protecting an account by requiring more than one form of proof before access is granted. It's just another layer of protection. So instead of relying on just a password, MFA usually combines something that you know, which is generally your password, with something that you have. So that would be a code that's sent to your maybe a phone or your authentication app. Most of us are probably familiar with the popular ones like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator. It's maybe worth pointing out as well that there are different terms, which can sometimes maybe make it a bit more confusing. Some people refer to 2FA, MFA, 2SV, but it's two-factor authentication or two-step verification. It's the same as multi-factor authentication. So there are different methods of achieving MFA. Each have their benefits and their drawbacks. But before I go on, I probably should make a point. I want to refer to a recent incident. So we recently had a case where there was a strong password was in use. MFA was enabled, but the email account was still compromised. And thankfully, there was a good response from the crew, and I don't believe there was any financial loss in this situation. So it's just a reminder that attacks can still happen.
So in this instance, suitable controls were in place, but the email account was still compromised?
Yes, correct. Yeah, attackers were still able to gain access, and there's still the possibility of them, stealing tokens. That was the example. But it's a bit like, I'm trying to think of it as another a safety analogy. It's a bit like wearing PPE. It significantly reduces the risk, but it doesn't remove it entirely. So on its own, it's not a silver bullet. It's a layer of defense, another layer.
This brings us to passkeys, which has recently been in news headlines. What are passkeys, and what is the guidance coming from the National Cybersecurity Centre?
Yeah, so as you say, it's been in the news headlines. Passkeys they're a more secure alternative to passwords. So the idea is that you don't have to remember any details because they're created and managed safely by the software on your device, whether that's your phone, your tablet, or your computer. A lot of, but not all, should point out, not all platforms are supporting the use of passkeys. This is fairly new. So they're more secure than passwords for a few reasons. The key reason is that passkeys are more resistant to phishing. They can't be intercepted and reused or stolen like passwords can be. So that removes one of the most common ways that accounts have been compromised in the past. They're said to be user-friendly. Before authorizing the use of a passkey, your device checks that it is actually you. And that's done by the means that you use to unlock your device. So typically facial recognition or a fingerprint or the PIN that you use. So the NCSC, they produced a technical paper which compared security of traditional, MFA compared to the use of passkeys, and that demonstrated that passkeys are always as secure or more secure than when you use two-step verification along with the strongest password. So I think this is interesting to raise it, because the other thing to know is that passkeys are fast and convenient. So they're reported to be 8 times faster than signing in with a password and MFA. You don't need to remember anything because the password manager, or I think the correct term we're supposed to use is a credential manager, but that creates and keeps the private key safe, and that can be synchronized across your devices. I think it's worth bearing in mind for those who find MFA a bit of an inconvenience. We've seen this in the past where people haven't applied MFA because of the inconvenience. It's probably worth saying that the inconvenience of being attacked is far greater than applying MFA. So last point on that, the NCSC reports there's substantial evidence where malicious actors are taking advantage of password authentication via phishing and spear phishing attacks, which we've been seeing. Passkeys are supposed to significantly reduce the likelihood of those phishing attacks, and that's the sort of attacks we've been seeing. It might also help to explain who NCSC are, because I've been referring to them. It's the National Cybersecurity Centre, and it's part of GCHQ, the Government Communication Headquarters. They help businesses in the public sector and individuals to protect the online services and the devices that we use and we depend on. So yeah, they're very much supporting the adoption of passkeys. As I said, this is very recent, but they recommend using them over passwords where it's available. So, if when you get the time, I'd say, check what the platforms offer passkeys. If they do, use them. But where you don't have a passkey, do stick to applying strong passwords and MFA.
In the incident we discussed earlier, would passkeys have made a difference?
It's a good question, fair question, still confirming some of the details of that instant. But the point I want to make is that this isn't an all or nothing shift. The guidance is about using the strongest available control on each platform. There is no perfect solution. It is about lowering the risk as best we can. The security controls available, they may have an impact when making the decisions on which platforms you want to use. If you're between using two different platforms, one of your decisions on which one to use should be looking at the security and access controls that are available on each one.
What should listeners take away from this podcast to better protect their online accounts?
I would say perhaps start by looking at your most critical accounts. So which accounts will cause you the most inconvenience, pain, heartbreak if they're to be compromised? Email, as we've mentioned before, finance applications, administration applications, and ask yourself some simple questions. Discuss it amongst you on board. What do they offer in terms of access controls? Does this platform support passkeys? Usually you can find that information within the security or privacy settings on the various apps. If it doesn't offer the likes of passkeys, then we'd say stick to using strong passwords and MFA. Make sure MFA is enforced. It is honestly worth the time to do this now because we have seen so many incidents where multi-factor authentication hadn't been applied and it could well have mitigated the risk. From a management side of things, it's good for us to review account protection during our audits, during our management reviews. Keep the conversation going with the crew when we're on board and visiting.
The cyber landscape is constantly evolving. How do we ensure we are keeping up? And how can we apply the ISM framework for continual improvement?
Yeah, exactly. It is evolving. Cyber controls should evolve just like any other safety equipment or procedures. We've seen the guidance change as technology improves. As cyber criminals become more sophisticated in their attacks, the controls have to become more advanced and more layered. When we were in the office years ago, we were forced to change our password every 3 months because that was the best guidance. They found over time that actually we sort of disengaged. We typically wouldn't use the strongest passwords because we had to change them frequently. So then it was, longer, more difficult passwords to guess. And now the advice then went on to using multi-factor authentication. And now we're learning about passkeys. So it does evolve and it's important. We do our best to stay up to date and we keep the conversation going.
In closing, so cybersecurity doesn't need to be complicated to be effective.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't always have to be complicated. Look at the access controls. Look at the use of passkeys where possible. It's reportedly simpler, faster, more secure. They're not available. Use strong passwords, MFA. I know I keep repeating myself, but we're not saying there is a perfect way of mitigating the risks. All of these control measures, we should document them and they should be controlled through the safety management system. So, that includes the reporting of incidents. That essentially is what has led to this conversation. Thanks to those on board who have reported when they have had incidents. It helps us learn. It's a great way of communicating so that we can prevent reoccurrence. The use of drills. I think we've seen some really good practices through the fleet using the drills to educate crew. We've seen great examples of crew quizzes to educate them on the types of phishing that they've experienced or they've seen. It's a great way to test your emergency response procedures to check they're fit for purpose. And then don't forget onboard education. We require, a designated ship cyber officer so that there is responsibility on board. And it's good to review that education because we always say, there's that term, education before mitigation. You have to have an understanding, at least of the basics, and identify where education perhaps needs to be applied, maybe from external companies. I think that the other point is clear guidance. We touched on communication already, but remember there's a cyber policy. We've got the safety management manual content. There's the risk assessments, which we need to keep updating, and the fleet circulars. So, keep your eye out for fleet circulars and updates from the management company. I think the last point is that we've talked a lot about the NCSC and their guidance. I would probably recommend, if you want more details on what we've been discussing, have a look at the NCSC's website. It is ncsc.gov.uk, and they do have a lot of useful guidance on the likes of password management, MFA, passkeys, how to spot phishing, how to respond to an incident. So definitely worth a look.
Many thanks for your time and valuable insights, Ewan.
My pleasure. Thanks, Matt. I think we've covered a small part in terms of cyber, but it's an important element and we all have to play a part. Thanks.